Good afternoon and good morning wherever you may be in the world, and welcome to this webinar titled Top 5 Challenges of Social Business Adaptation and How to Resolve Them Effectively. It is the fourth and final in our series of webinars recapping our Social Connections 12 sessions from October this year. That was held in Vienna. My name is Danny. I'll be assisting Lewis in the background of the webinar today. Before I hand it over to him, just a few things that I want to make you aware of. The first is that your phone line or computer mics will be muted, but of course we do encourage you to ask any questions that you have in the GoToWebinar question panel. The webinar is scheduled for 45 minutes, including a Q&A at the end of the presentation, at which point we will get to the questions that you ask. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to you, Lewis.
Thank you, Danny. And hello and welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. So eventually, what we're going to talk about is this particular question, right? And we're going to be spending a few minutes to talk about what would be the #1 challenge within our social business journey. And the purpose of this presentation, which is, as Danny mentioned, a redo of a Social Connections session that I did, is eventually trying to share what some of the main challenges that I have seen over the course of the last 17 years that I've been doing social networking for business, and see how many of those would relate to your #1 challenge, right? And later on, if you would want to, on the Q&A, share your thoughts as well about whether you may have additional challenges. Obviously, I realize that there are plenty more challenges out there. There are lots of obstacles and different inhibitors and so forth, but I'm going to focus on the major 5. And of the major 5, I would also talk a little bit about what I think is the main one, the main challenge around social business adaptation and our various different digital journeys. The idea here, obviously, is to give an opportunity to not only highlight the various different challenges, but what you can do about each of the various different challenges, of the various different 5 challenges. Now, the thing that I want to mention here as well is that for each of those challenges, I'm going to offer 3 potential ways of how you can resolve them, right? And that will include an opportunity to think about 3 different ways of how you can approach each of those challenges based on the context of how you may be working and what you may be doing and everything else. So without much further ado, I'm going to start with the challenge #1. And by the way, the order is at random, so don't think that challenge #1 is the worst. I'm actually personally put the slides in such a way that the order is random, and then out of all of it, I will pick up the #1 challenge that I think is crippling most organizations when they're doing their social business journeys. So challenge #1, ownership. If, in my experience, one of the things that has happened over the course of the years is that as soon as you have got a particular business unit organization responsible for that so-called social business journey, everyone else feels like it's no longer their baby, right? So if you have, for instance, communications, if you have got HR, if you have got IT, if you have got marketing and sales, owning that effort, everyone else feels like they are displaced, right? And the idea here from this particular challenge is that in most cases, you will see lots of organizations that will make progress, making use of their ESNs, their enterprise social networking environment, but they will only do it for that particular business unit. So if it is in communications, it will be used as a communication tool. If you want to use it as an opportunity to manage IT, it will be associated with IT and so forth. So the idea here with this particular challenge for ownership, and 3 things that you can do, is #1 is introduce a hybrid transformation team. So the people who are responsible for driving that particular adaptation, for influencing that particular shift of mentality and behaviors, and ensure that in that team you have got people from all business units. So you have got people from IT, from communications, from HR, from marketing and sales, from research, from whatever business unit that you may have within the organization. And the idea there is that if you make it a co-ownership effort, everyone will feel like they are co-owning it. They are part of it. It's their baby all of a sudden, right? So what you have in there is that you have an opportunity to see how when you give people the chance to say, hey, we all need to chip in, people will eventually chip in accordingly. One other way of how you can address the ownership issue is not necessarily based on a team or business unit, but actually put together a community of change leaders. Essentially, your flat army that will help you somehow execute on the various different adaptation techniques or strategies that you may have. And obviously, when you build a community, one of the major things about communities is that they are open, inclusive, and rather public and transparent, which means that you will have people from across the various different business units, and they will help you cross-pollinate across organizations through that particular community. Now, that community, and this is the third option that you have there in terms of how you can address the ownership challenge, is that you have the opportunity that once you have that community going, you will give an opportunity to build an entire community building program around that social business journey. Now, one of the things that most people will tell you is that all of this social networking is about the me, me, me. Only care about yourself as an individual, right? Eventually, what happens within organizations is that the major influences, the major drivers of that adaptation towards digital tools is actually not individuals, it's communities. And again, communities being open, inclusive, and transparent and public in terms of how they work, what they will do is they will help you cross-pollinate the various different interactions across the board. So you can basically go across the various different times and challenges, or geographies, or business units, or different topics, and then focus on social networking, essentially helping people connect and learn from one another. So right there, the whole challenge around ownership transforms itself into co-ownership. Number 2 challenge, cost savings. Now, back maybe 10, 15 years ago, there was this mantra that, people were sort of like overwhelmed by having too many tools, when in reality they had one or two. Now, 2017, and the whole thing around that we have here is that we definitely have got a lot more digital tools than we used to. And one of the main premises that most businesses actually use to choose from one enterprise social networking platform over another is essentially a cost savings reason. And I'm going to say reason when in reality I was thinking about excuse. Right now, the whole thing about cost savings is a very tricky one, because most businesses, the only thing that they will do is focus on the operational efficiency, and that means trying to have the coolest tools for the cheapest price. Now, here's an interesting thing. If you ever do social business adaptation or digital transformation or whatever you want to call it, just with the excuse of cost savings, I'm going to tell you straightforward today, you're bound to fail. And the reason for that is because there's always going to be something cheaper out there that you would want to move to. So that constant change of going for the cheaper option is definitely not going to help you move forward in that transformation process, because you will be basically hopping from one to another. So the way to address the cost savings issue and the too many tools perception in terms of tool overload is 3 things that you can do. Number 1, co-share the budget. We talk about co-ownership. Now, obviously, when you have got multiple business units chipping in, you also have the expectation that multiple business units will also be chipping in with a budget. And that will mean that instead of having one team, one business division, or one team unit being responsible for the entire budget of that transformation effort, now it becomes transversal, it becomes horizontal. So multiple team units or business units would want to chime in and also incorporate part of that budget and be responsible for that budget, right? So you will have an opportunity to get more involvement from their point of view, because obviously now they put the money. They don't just put the resources in terms of people working on it, or they just don't put the processes in place, but they put the money, right? Now, one of the things about addressing the challenge of too many tools for that tool overload is that we need to understand that when you work in an organization, you have got multiple groups. You go from individuals to teams, to networks, to communities, to crews, to whatever other online grouping that you can have. And each of them is going to have a different need. And the whole mantra around social networking for business is, how do you try to accommodate as many needs as possible in that adaptation journey? And one of the realizations in here is that the good old mantra that we used to have 10, 15 years ago about the one size fits all is no longer relevant. And the reason for that is because everyone will have a different purpose in terms of what they would want to do within that social networking environment. The opportunity there is to help identify what those various different purposes will be like and how people will be using them accordingly. And the idea here is to understand that it's okay to have more than one tool. It's okay to have the opportunity to cater for as many different needs from groups, or different groups as we would have. And the actual challenge there is not necessarily about having too many tools, is how do they connect it with one another? So if you provide an opportunity to not create more silos on top of other silos, but create a more open, public, and transparent way in terms of how those tools talk to one another, so that those different groups talk to one another, you will essentially be addressing this particular challenge of the cost savings and the too many tools. Think about the larger picture, which is essentially get everyone involved, accommodate everyone's needs from the different groups that you're working with, and understanding that one size does not fit all no longer works, that you need to have multiple tools to cater for multiple needs and wants from the various different knowledge workers. Challenge number 3. Now, this is something that those of you who may know me, I have been very strong advocate about how important narrative is in terms of how you influence change and how you entice people to shift behaviors and mindset and everything else. And this is one of the things that I have always found a challenge for most people, because the way they say things, act now, relates to the need of running another IT project. And we're not talking about another IT project. We're talking about a transformation program, an initiative, one where you know when you begin, but you never know where you're going to end, because it's constant change. And we're not talking about adoption. We're not talking about adopting pets or kids. We're talking about adaptation in terms of how do we adapt to that constant flux of new tools that is coming up and everything else. And you see there a list of correlation terms in terms of the way you say things. It's going to be more important than anything else in terms of how people may be listening to you, right? So how we move there from drive to inspire, from empowerment to enablement, from digital transformation to digital adaptation, from create to co-create, from engagement to involvement. As you can see, plenty of the words on the left column are fully loaded already. For instance, the whole notion around employee engagement, around digital transformation, about empowerment. And the way of how we say things to the rest of the employee workforce is going to be very critical, because it's going to help them understand how we're talking about something completely different, something that cannot be treated the way we have done it before with traditional methods like change management, for instance, or knowledge management, or communications, or whatever else. This is more of knowing when you start, but not when you finish. And the way you say things is going to matter tremendously. Now, I know that there are a lot of other concepts out there that you can think about how people used to put them in the context of being IT projects and what you can do now and everything else. But this list that I put here is good enough for me to start conveying the message that this is something completely different to whatever we have been doing in the past. Now, if you ask me about what are my favorite words from the right column, the ones that you see there, I will go and say adaptation, enablement, persuasion, and hierarchy. If you notice, none of those are traditionally the common speak of how you manage a particular project or particular team. So the idea that we have in here is that we're talking about something completely different than whatever we have been doing in the past. And as such, the way we do say things matters. So careful about the narrative that you use, because it will probably become an obstacle and a challenge over the course of time. Challenge number 4. This is perhaps one of the most important ones, although I can tell you that it's not the main one that I can select from the list in terms of what I think is the major obstacle, right? But culture is right where it is. And this is the notion that most people seem to ignore the culture. And I'm going to substitute here culture as well for something called sociology, which is essentially everything that hasn't got to do anything with technology. So the idea here is that if you look into plenty of these enterprise social networking programs around digital transformation and social business, they're all based on a technology focus. Mostly with the main mantra that if you build the tech, they will come. Now, reality tells us that's a different game, right? Just because you put there nice, really fancy tools, people will not necessarily make use of them. In fact, we have seen this over the course of the last 15 years, because email still is the #1 tool that people use to communicate and collaborate with one another, right? So this is not about technology. This is all about culture. This is all about mindset, about behaviors. And in most cases, what happens in here is that in most of the various different change initiatives, we have been ignoring dramatically how we actually need to look after culture, how we need to influence culture, how we need to, when you talk about this digital transformation journey, it's not necessarily about what tools people use. Is about the mindset that people have in order to make use of these tools, about the different behaviors. And three different ways of how we can address the culture change, the culture challenge. Number one is that we need to understand that change is very hard and that we cannot change people. The only thing that we can do is we can change the conditions by which people will need to act and decide what they want to do. And we need to understand that change happens only in small increments. That is much easier to do lots of tiny things all over the place around your change initiative than one massive change program that no one comprehends or understands fully what they're all about. You can actually measure progress much easier if you do that change in small increments than if you do the whole picture of what the change initiative or the change management initiative will be like. Right? Now, a second way of answering, and this is something that I touched earlier on based in terms of different groups and having different needs, is always try to answer the question about what's in it for me versus let's put some tools together and because they're so cheap, let's go and do it. Who cares? Well, we do care. I do care as a knowledge worker in terms of what's in it for me. If you're asking me to change, you will need to influence or you will need to try to convince me as to why I need that change. Is it going to make me better? Is it going to make me more effective? Is it going to make me more productive? Is it going to help me connect with the organization? Is it going to affect in my business results becoming more effective towards growing revenue or whatever else? Unless we try to answer the what's in it for me beyond technology and more into that sociology change and mindset, we will struggle with it. And I know that most of you may be thinking like, hang on, but you're asking me to ask hundreds of thousands of employees about the what's in it for me. And I said, well, that's one of the key items around social networking, the ability for you to ask openly that question and then be open, in a way, if I can say that, to active listening, to listen carefully what they tell you as to what will be the main reason as they will move in. Do they want to address new business opportunities, create new markets, fix or address business pain points? That activity of trying to answer that what's in it for me is going to be critical. And the sooner you start, the better. Now, the third item here is also that when you think about these digital transformation initiatives, it's never been about technology. No matter what vendors tell you, no matter what they tell you about having the best tools and the fanciest and the sexiest interfaces and the best flows ever, it's never been about technology. It's always been about the people. Right? And if you look, for instance, into studies around employee engagement, employee involvement from Gallup, for instance, where they have done all those studies over the course of the last 16, 17 years, you will notice how despite of having the best technology ever, people are not necessarily more involved in the work they do. And the reason for that is because the focus on the business has never been on the people, has never been on looking after the people, after the well-being. There have always been more around business processes and the technology itself. And if there's one thing, for instance, as an example that I can quote in here in terms of that culture change, starts with something as simple as picking up one team, one division, in this case, human resources, HR, and think that the sociology aspect comes in when we start talking about human resources and we start talking about human relationships. That's when we know that we're trying to influence that culture change. When we focus more on the well-being of the employee workforce and their effectiveness versus overloading them with more technology because it's cheaper for us. Now, the fifth challenge, senior management. Now, I know that most people will probably be surprised about this one. And this is basically based on my 17 years of experience. But there's always been a situation where the major hurdle in terms of the various different change initiatives around social networking for business has always been management. And the reason for that is because there's this notion that management feels that this is a threat to their status, to their power, to their influence, when all of a sudden you see that the role of the boss transforms into the role of the leader. That the way you were doing, the way managers were managing through command and control, through fear, through politics, through bureaucratic games, etc., that's a thing of the past. So one of the things that happens in there is that when you put all of these social tools in context of using them as the way you interact, management is going to put a natural hurdle in there because they don't want to lose the influence and the control they had. So, and it may not be obvious, but you can see this already when, if you work in whatever the organization and you ask, do you have management buy-in? Do you have leadership buy-in? If the answer that you have is no, or if the answer that you get is, well, yes, they're sponsoring the effort, they're, putting some money and everything else, then you know that management is a challenge, because this is not about how vocal you are in supporting the effort. This is not about how much money you put on the table to help them out. This is about how you lead by example, actively involving in these new kinds of conversations that are happening across the board, where everyone is on the same level of conversation, which is essentially sharing what they know, sharing their expertise. So what 3 things can you do about senior management as an obstacle? Number 1, perhaps the easiest one, ignore them, right? I can tell you an example. In my previous work experience, I used to work for IBM for 17 years. And one of the examples that I always quote is that we started using some of these various different social networking tools around the year 2000. We had the first people aggregator around 2000, 2001. And it took us 12 years, I'm going to repeat that, 12 years for the company CEO to start blogging. Did we stop because management wasn't bought into it? Did we stop because management was a hurdle? No, we just ignored it gently, obviously, and then moved on and carry on with it. Understanding that at one point in time, it will have to click for management. They will have to and they will realize that they're the ones being left behind. Why? Because everyone else is doing it. Why? Because the conversations are happening without them on the table. So that ignore management is probably the most effective way that you can have to eventually keep moving forward. Remember, change in small increments, keep moving forward without paying attention to them. Understanding, this is the second item, that we have got different waves of adapters, or early adopters, as some of the wording goes by. The idea here is that you cannot have everyone on the same boat from day one. So you need to have a number of different boats that people can sail on over the course of time, and leave it down to management to decide when they want to jump in on the boat, right? So understanding that if they're not on the first wave, they may be on the second, on the third, on the fifth, or whatever the actual wave, eventually they will need to come back on it. Why? Because if they don't, they will be left behind. And then using that same metaphor, the boats will sail along and they will be left behind. And what happens in here is that obviously when we talk about management or senior management, it doesn't mean that 100% of management will be a roadblock or an inhibitor or an obstacle. But there's an opportunity that there may be some managers that have made the transition into becoming leaders. You see the nice, lovely chart of some of the differences of what a boss is like and what a leader is like. So you may have some of those senior change leaders already championing by example, leading by example, on the effective use of that social networking for business. So your job in there is find them, highlight them, socialize them, communicate their success, tell the world why they're social leaders, why they're change leaders, why they think different and do different. So what you're trying to do there is you're trying to essentially have an opportunity to not only give you the window of opportunity to enter that senior management field, but also to see what it is like from the inside, to see how they themselves see the value, how they themselves have answered the what's in it for me, and how they have continued to make use of it from that point of view, from that perspective, right? So you have an opportunity where you have the chance of finding your allies, if you want to say that, right? And in this case, there will always be people who will be those change leaders that are higher up in the organization, that are willing to be showcased and be communicated about and socialize their success story, etc., etc. The challenge is finding them. And how do you find them? Very easily. Ask around. Ask around about, whose manager is different, or who can come up with a manager that acts more like a leader in terms of the traits that you see on that chart as an example, for instance, right? Or which senior leader uses our social networking platform on a daily basis, not just as a communications platform, but as a networking platform, right? Now, when you have all of that in context, you have an opportunity to disrupt the management chain. And here's the thing, it's not about replacing management with something else. It's about helping the organization understand that management needs to change, it needs to shift. It needs to go from that potential toxic environment of command and control, of bureaucracy, of playing political games, into true leadership. So it's not that you're trying to replace it. It's what you're doing is you're trying to enhance and get rid of whatever the toxic elements that it has to make it a better management moving into that role of leadership altogether. Now, if you notice, all of these various different challenges that I have mentioned in here, they are highlighting how social business is really tough, right? And no one can deny that. You know, if you look into how social business came about as a concept, we will have to probably go back to 2006 when it was first introduced. And that's essentially 11 years ago. And very little progress has been made. The reason for that is because we seem to have gotten distracted with technology. So vendors coming up with new fancy tools to allow us to do the same thing that we were doing before, which is essentially email and file sharing. And eventually forgetting about the whole notion behind social networking, about openness, about transparency, about breaking down the silos where needed and where applicable. So the whole purpose of this particular slide is to not forget that social business is tough, that is hard work, that is not going to happen overnight, that we need to have a commitment for the long term. And that long term happens between the 15 to 20 to 30 years from wherever you start. So if you started 10 years ago, you still have 15 years to go. If you start today, you will see that particular transformation happening in 15, 20, 25 years. Is committing to the long term, not to the short term gain of going for the cheapest bid because it helps you look good from a business point of view, right? Now, also remember that social business is about changing in small increments. It's about doing lots of tiny things, lots of tiny habits. It's about changing different behaviors one at a time, about different things and how we behave. But instead of thinking about change management as a whole program, a whole mammoth there waiting for us to devour us, the whole idea here is think about it in small parts, in small chunks, and how our brain works better and more effectively when we think about small increments, when we think about small fragments, than when we think about one thing as a whole, right? And finally, it is one thing that I have learned over the course of the years around why social business is so tough is because it requires a lot of patience and perseverance. And the reason why I'm saying that is because plenty of people lose patience when they don't see results in 3 months, in 6 months, in 18 months. And remember the example that I mentioned earlier on. It took us, when I was at IBM, 12 years to get the CEO to blog. That's what patience is all about. So think about that and persevere. You know, perseverance is good in the sense of being obstinate, of being a bit stubborn in terms of, you know, this is the kind of new way that you want to work. This is not about putting more lipstick on the pig and still a pig. This is about how you want to transform the way you work. So it's not just about solving problems. It's about redefining how we work, how we connect, how we learn, how we move into new operating models like networks and communities versus just only teams, which is what we have been doing all along. So the idea here is that once you start on that change journey, that social business journey, it never stops. And it's a constant struggle of moving forward, of changing in small increments and using lots of patience and perseverance in terms of addressing all of the various different challenges that you have seen on this presentation today. And like I said before, there will be many more. So what I would like to do with that is essentially think for a minute, and I'm going to ask a question here. So I'm not going to ask you for the answer, but just think about that particular question. Which one would you want to pick as the biggest obstacle from the list that I have just mentioned so far, right? And remember, we had ownership, we had cost savings, we had narrative, we had culture, and we had management. So which one of those 5 challenges would you say is the biggest obstacle? Now, obviously, you may have hinted, and you're rightly so. My answer, you know, feel free to share your answer on the chat if you would want to, but my answer is essentially management. They're the biggest obstacle right now. And the reason for that is, again, because of that notion that their position and influence is at risk, right? And their status. So the idea here is, how do we persuade management that this is not about replacing them, but this is about helping them understand that we need to work in different ways, that we need to become smarter and work smarter, not necessarily harder, that we need to become more open, more public, more transparent, that we need to connect with people, learn with people, collaborate with people, versus just essentially working in silos, top-down command and control silos. So the idea here is, I mentioned the three things that you can do around the basic challenges in terms of management and what you could do about it, right? And a quick recap. The number one thing that you can do around management, if they're not cooperative, if they're not willing to help you out, not just with the sponsorship, but also with funding or whatever, but leading by example, is ignore them. Give them time to adjust to the change when they see that they're ready for it, right? And if you have got a number of various different change leaders already in small pockets, in different units or whatever else, group them, gather them together, give them a sense of purpose, which is helping all of the other various different change leaders understand how they can work together and do things different. And in this case, support the effort of transforming the way the organization works. And once you have that, you will be in a better position to say, all of these various different obstacles and challenges that we had, it's something that we need to work on. It's essentially a change initiative that needs to happen, and that you can find different ways, different strategies of how you can manage them all together. So I hope that with this presentation, you have lots of ammunition that you can do for those 5 challenges and perhaps some others. And I think that we're now probably ready to go for questions, Danny. I don't know if you had them coming through on the chat.
I think we are definitely ready for questions. Quite a few that have come in. The first is from Tracy regarding the long-term commitment and the patience and perseverance. Not all of us have that, but you mentioned at the beginning that you've been in the social networking for business space for over 17 years. If you were to start from scratch, from all over again today, what would you do differently to address as many of these challenges as you can?
Well, I would do 2 things. Number one is I would have ignored management from day one. I didn't. I was one of those people who strongly believed back then that unless you had executive buy-in, you could not do anything at all. And experience and having worked, those years at IBM and then with other various different corporations and helping out different clients, one of the things that I have understood from that experience is that you don't need to wait for management to jump on board. You can already do lots of things. The difference thing here is that if you think about management buy-in, you're already thinking in terms of that mammoth around change management, the whole load, the whole program, the whole spectrum of transforming the organization. If you ignore management, that means that you basically shift into changing in small increments. So you will do tons of tiny things, tons of tiny habits that are different. And that will help you build the momentum from a grassroots effort so that when management is ready, you can go and say, well, are you ready to jump on board? And if you are, we're going to help you. And if you're not, we're just going to keep going, right? So you basically not necessarily saying that you would rely or that I would rely on a bottom-up grassroots effort. We need to have a hybrid. We need to go from bottom up and top down. But I'm not going to wait, or I wouldn't wait now for top down to come. I will basically keep moving with those, changing in small increments. So that will be one thing that I would do. The second thing that I would do is I will focus almost exclusively on HR. And the reason for that is around the whole thing around ownership. HR is the only business unit that can touch all of the other business units and change the way people work through the various different processes, incentives, rewards, job descriptions, job titles, career development, etc., etc. They are the only group that can influence the shift in terms of how people work. Remember what I said later on. Change is very hard. You cannot change people, but you can change the conditions. And the only transversal group that can change the conditions right now within any organization is HR. So I would focus exclusively on HR to help build that co-ownership, that co-creation effort of having on that one table lots of the various different business units, but HR needs to be the driving force.
Okay, fascinating. I think that leads on to the second question, actually, from Ilya. Change is difficult, but is there a single solution for all the challenges, a golden goose, so to speak?
I wish I could say that there is, but there isn't. There isn't a single solution that will work out. And I'll tell you two reasons why. Number one, every organization is unique. Every organization is different. So when you start, so when you meet into someone, when you bump into someone who tells you, can you tell me what are the best practices of all of these social business? Run away like the plague from it, because there's no single solution for it. Every organization is different. Every organization has got different context, and essentially every organization has got a different purpose of why they would want to transform. So there isn't a single solution. And frankly, if someone would tell me, oh, I'm going to give you the one solution that you need, I will run away. I will not even pay attention to it, because that means that they have not cared about the context of my own organization and how we work and what we want to do, whether we want to create new business opportunities or address business pain points or whatever else. But the interesting thing in here is that on purpose, throughout the whole presentation, I have always mentioned that we're talking about obstacles, about inhibitors, about stoppers, about hurdles, but eventually you will need these as business opportunities. And the reason why I'm saying that is that if you're trying to do any change initiative and you don't have any obstacles, you don't have any showstoppers, that means that you're not working hard enough on it. That means that you're not going right into the deep roots of the organization and how it works. You're bound to find these obstacles. You're bound to get rid of these obstacles as best as you can. But if you don't see any, if everything goes smooth, hunky-dory, that means that you have a problem. That means that you're not addressing the real needs of the organization. So whenever you bump into these obstacles, I'm going to tell you it's a good thing. It's healthy. The challenge there, the opportunity there, is to identify, do I know how to solve it? And if I don't, who can I go out with out there that can help me out? So start talking, start becoming more open, more public about what you're doing. Start helping find all the people who can help you face and address each of those different obstacles. But you will need them. In order for the change initiative to be successful, you will need them. There's no best practice for social business adaptation. Maybe there's plenty of, or there are plenty of good practices, but those good practices, they will only get better as you keep iterating them, right? So I'm afraid that there isn't a single solution, and that you will need the challenges. The challenges are healthy. They help you grow. They help you learn. You need them for the change initiatives.
Okay, so it seems like Chris is in this very situation right now. He's in the process of finding the people. He's asking, though, why is it so hard to change people's habits, their mindset and behaviors? Is he doing something wrong?
I don't think that there's doing anything wrong. Changing, like I said before, change is really hard. And when you talk about all of these various different change initiatives and the social business journey, eventually you're talking about how you can influence the changing in people's habits, in people's behaviors. And unfortunately, inertia and a status quo are two very powerful components that are very much against change. So if you have an employee that is not very much involved, that they're disengaged, or that they're actively disengaged, for instance, it's going to be very difficult for them to change. Why? Because they're gone from the organization. They no longer feel motivated. They're only waiting for the paycheck at the end of the month, and that's about it, right? Now, if you look into other people on the other side of the spectrum, imagine that, for instance, you have got top sellers, right? That they're on the top of the scale, and they're incredibly helpful. They're very productive. They're very effective. They always make their quotas and everything else. They're going to ask you back, like, why should I change when I'm doing really well? So the understanding there is that this is not necessarily about how you propose the change. It's about how you see the opportunity of helping people transform the way they work. And essentially, the way I describe this, in terms of the whole notion behind digital transformation and why change is so hard and why changing people's habits is so hard, is because we have focused all the time on changing people's habits, when in reality, we should focus on changing the conditions as to why people behave the way they do. That's what we need to do. That's the actual focus. And believe me, the moment that we focus into the systems change versus the individual change, we will have a much easier life and even more effective in terms of what we do. Why? Because we will be not only providing the conditions as to how people can solve problems, become more effective at what they do. But also we will provide an opportunity or a window into how they can transform the way they work, which is essentially what we want to do with all of these digital transformation initiatives.
Excellent. That's all the questions that we've been given that you've answered very well. I think with that, we're coming to the end of the presentation. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. It was the last webinar of 2017. Nevertheless, there are a few more in the pipeline for the beginning of 2018. You can find out what they are on our webinar page, as well as all the recordings from past webinars, including today's. So if you think that someone else in your organization would benefit from hearing what Lewis has to say, then by all means go to that webinar page, the link of which will be sent to you in the follow-up email. So with that, I'll give you, Lewis, the last word, and I will then end the webinar for today.
All right. Well, my last few words is probably going back to this slide and highlight about the focus, the shift of focus into commitment to long-term, change in small increments, and use lots of patience and perseverance, and keep going, keep going. This is not about another IT project. This is about how you want to transform the way you and your colleagues work. And the best way of doing that is get going today. Do things, do tiny things, small increments, and have earlier on lots of very small impacts about how you want to transform the organization. And from there onwards, keep going. Don't let any of these obstacles stop you. Thanks everyone for watching us, and we'll hope to see you soon in the next one.